Hey, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see you. I want to wish you all the loveliest of holiday seasons. I want you all to rejoice in the joy of this occasion because, you know, it's Christmas time. It's the time for merriness. It's the time for revelry. It's the time to join with our friends, with our family, and wish good tidings to all. I don't even really know what the word tidings means, but I've been told that it reflects some kind of holiday greeting. And this is holiday greeting time. And, you know, so today of all days, before we get into the serious aspect of what we're going to talk about tonight, I did want to make sure that all of you, are actually preparing to have something of a Merry Christmas. Because if you're not, then that makes you a bit of a Scrooge, doesn't it? And it makes you, I think, out of step with the general ambiance of the current season. And nobody likes guys and gals who are out of step with the ambiance of the current season. Isn't that right? Isn't that simply true? Isn't what's right and true this time of year, of all times, to engage in some revelry, to forget all the downers and the haters and the losers and the whiners, the complainers, and to, reflect on the good times. That, I think, is the true meaning of Christmas. And I want to thank you for listening to my Christmas-related soliloquy because I save it up all year and then I share it with the internet. And then that's supposed to make everyone swell with cheer. Anyway, what may not make you swell with cheer is what's going on policy-wise nowadays with, yet again, the whole COVID situation. And this is not a subject that I feel particularly merry about harping on once again, but there is just a real lack of, I think, appropriately critical or skeptical coverage in much of the media at the moment. Now, as far as Omicron, or as I like to say, come on, as far as that variant, which we're all supposed to be hyper concerned about, increasingly you do see even the more mainstream elements of the media, like the New York Times and such, reporting that it appears to be less severe. I'm not going to get into the epidemiological details of that because I stay in my lane. I don't purport to be an epidemiological expert, although that doesn't preclude me from weighing in on certain elements of this. I mean, everybody's affected, so everybody's entitled to make certain judgments, I would think, about how they should act in response to the onset of this supposed variant, or what precautions they should or should not take, or what policies government should or should not institute. But that aside, what's plainly happening is that Omicron, or Okamon, has provided a pretext for different jurisdictions in the US, which is what I'm going to focus on, but also around the world, to institute measures that they clearly would have wanted to institute anyway, but now Omicron, quote unquote, gives them a putative basis for doing so. What do I mean by that? Well, Just this week, you had Boston, Washington, D.C., Chicago institute vaccine passport measures. Now, often they don't call them vaccine passports exactly because that has certain connotations that make it seem maybe a bit dicey. But effectively, they're vaccine passport schemes. And how are they actually instituting these schemes? Or in other words, what is the power that they're invoking? What is the governmental authority that they are citing to bring into effect these measures? Because you'd think that a measure as sweeping and as far-reaching in its societal implications as a vaccine passport regimen would maybe benefit from being subjected to the deliberative process, meaning you have hearings in a legislative body, meaning you have an opportunity for public input, meaning you have a thoroughgoing public airing of the pros and cons, meaning you deliberate the ramifications of such a policy, because this is a fairly fundamental change to the public arena, or the public spaces, in that in order to enter facilities like a restaurant or a gym or an entertainment venue, etc., even in some cities they're doing this for like City Hall or a city-owned building, requiring that medical status be declared in order for an individual to enter the facility. And if they don't have the requisite medical status, then they can be denied entry. That's a fairly radical shift in how we understand the accessibility of these public venues. And you could very easily see these passport-style systems that have now been imposed in different major cities morphing down the line to require additional disclosures, maybe even not related to COVID at all, maybe having nothing to do with the current vaccine regimen that is being said we must abide by. Either way, it would benefit from some pretty serious debate. So how is it that these schemes are being implemented in circumvention of that kind of debate, which you think would be obligatory? Well, they're doing it because all across the US, if you look at the fine print of how these governmental jurisdictions are implementing these orders, you'll notice that in virtually every case that I've seen anyway, mayors and other governmental officials are invoking their emergency powers. And not just invoking their emergency powers, they're saying that the emergency powers that were first declared in March or April of 2020, so approaching 2 years ago, are still applicable today as they're seeking to impose as far-reaching measures as vaccine passports, right? So the emergency powers that were, for instance, declared in Boston, Mass, in March of 2020, were invoked just this very week as the basis on which the mayor and the public health commission there had the authority to institute vaccine passports. And you'll never know this if you don't look at the actual fine print of these orders. I'll even quote it to you here. It's the text of the order in Boston. It says, whereas a public health emergency due to the outbreak of the 2019 novel coronavirus in the city of Boston, pursuant to the declaration of the Boston Health Commission dated March 15, 2020 and extended on April 24, 2020, remains in full force and effect. Got that? Remains in full force and effect. The public emergency that was proclaimed maybe with some justification, maybe not, in March of 2020, remains today in as full force and effect as it was in March 2020. That's in Boston. Okay, so what does that indicate to you? To me, it indicates that public officials, in the name of implementing measures that otherwise would maybe run up against some democratic opposition, are making an end run where they can cite the perpetuation, the perpetual existence of these so-called emergency powers to get what they want, policy-wise. And that is a pretty ominous development, because one thing that I certainly warned about from the outset, and other civil libertarian-minded individuals warned about, even if maybe they were willing to initially make some accommodations to a public health quote-unquote emergency, nonetheless, I said certainly contemporaneously that we have to be very mindful and suspicious of elected officials and government bureaucracies using the powers that have been accorded to them, seemingly on temporary grounds, to basically empower themselves indefinitely and to just govern by fiat on the supposed basis of this permanent emergency. And sure enough, that's what's happening in many jurisdictions today. And you'd be amazed by the number of jurisdictions throughout the country, even in some places you might not expect, that today, as of this week, continue to cite their supposed emergency powers that derive from that initial proclamation in March of 2020. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In New Mexico, the governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, has continuously renewed what is called a public health emergency in the state. And the renewal will last through at least this coming January, although there's very little reason to believe that these orders will not be renewed even further, given the supposed frenzy around Omicron. And she's invoking that authority, quote, the full scope of her emergency powers, end quote, to continue to enforce stuff like the indoor mask mandate and the school mask mandate. And that authority pretty much is not being challenged. New York City, which in Boston, they're citing the vaccine passport model of New York City that was implemented in September of this year as their inspiration for doing much the same in Boston. How was exactly Mayor de Blasio in New York City able to get that vaccine passport measure through? Well, he was able to do it on the basis of his unilateral authority because New York City has continually extended its own, quote, state of emergency since March of 2020. And that state of emergency was the basis on which Bill de Blasio was able to proclaim that proof of vaccination must be provided at all manner of these indoor venues. So basically, and on and on and on. In Delaware, there's a state of emergency. In Indiana, there's a public health emergency today. New Jersey, state of emergency today. California, state of emergency through at least March of next year. Declaration of emergency in Nevada. Iowa, state of public health disaster emergency continues to be declared. Miami-Dade County, Florida, state of emergency gets extended every 7 days. Honolulu, Hawaii, San Antonio, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, Portland, Maine. This is just a small sampling, okay? All around the country, different jurisdictions, state, local, city, town, county, blah, blah, blah. They are continuing to extend their emergency powers. And I would think that people could eventually come to recognize, again, even if they were willing to entertain some of these restrictions or impositions at the beginning, I would think they could maybe begin to apprehend that a permanent emergency, an emergency so-called, in which government officials can continue to exert unprecedented new powers almost 2 years after the fact, maybe needs to be revisited at its very conceptual core. A permanent emergency is a contradiction in terms. It's oxymoronic. An emergency should be, I would think, given its traditional conception, a confined period of time, right, where you need to take rash action to curtail an acute threat. Well, whatever COVID or Omicron is now, it is not seemingly anywhere close to the acuteness of a threat that could have at least reasonably been asserted in March of 2020. And yet here we are. And so there's so much more on this, and I want to get into additional examples and some broader implications on the Rockfin feed. So if you're watching on YouTube, switch over there, link in the description box, and we shall continue momentarily.